It's great to be back at AUBG. I have to tell you, I missed this place. I signed a one-year deal because I have a 13-year-old, who's now 14-year-old daughter, so I miss her. But I had a great year here, so it's great to be back. I want to thank Professor White for making this possible. I have to get to Sofia right after the talk. Unfortunately, I have to get in a cab and bolt, so I can't stay around and schmooze, which I would like to. But I'll be back. I'll be back to AUBG. Now, this talk is about immigration to the United States, which obviously is where I'm from. It's the country I know best. But the principles apply more broadly. I mean, they apply to immigration generally, I think, not just immigration into the U.S. So, I want to make the moral case for open immigration, or generally open immigration, and the practical case. And the moral case is based on the principle of individual rights, which is the founding moral principle of the United States. As Thomas Jefferson, paraphrasing John Locke, wrote that every individual has the inalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So individual rights is a moral principle, and the key part of it is this: your life belongs to you. Your life does not belong to the state, does not belong to the church, it does not belong to the family. Your life belongs to you. And what that means then is that applies in the realm of personal morality. That as a consenting adult, it's your right to. You have the freedom of speech, freedom of intellectual expression, freedom of religion, freedom to read what you will, to listen to what you will, and so forth. And also in the economic sphere, your right to work hard, earn money, buy property, own property, which then belongs to you. Your right to start your own business if you're entrepreneurial, to make money, to retain the profit that you earn. So individual rights is a principle here, and notice then on this view, these ideas, which are basically English in origin and then were put into practice in the former English colonies in North America. John Locke, of course, a very important figure in this regard, is that what then morally legitimizes government? Why should we have a government? What makes it morally legitimate? And that is the answer on these premises is a government, what morally legitimizes a government is that it protects an individual's right to his or her own life. George Washington put this very nicely, a good Lockean. President Washington said, quote, "Government, like fire, is a dangerous servant," unquote. I love that quote. My business ethics students here last year probably heard it 100 times. Government, like fire, is a dangerous servant. Notice, first of all, government is a servant on this view. Its role is to protect the rights of citizens, the right to your own life, primarily. And notice Washington saying, like comparing it to fire, that analogy, that fire has the power to heat our homes and cook our food and everything, but it also has the power to burn the home down. And government, which has the power to protect our rights, then can acquire the power to violate those rights as well. And so on the Lockean, Jeffersonian view, the government must be shackled. And of course, you need a written constitution with a Bill of Rights carefully outlining the proper role of government and what it can and cannot do, and of course, guaranteeing to citizens inalienable rights, freedom of religion, freedom of speech are two famous ones. So that's what morally legitimizes the government. It's a servant. Its purpose is to protect individual rights. Now let's apply this to the issue of immigration and emigration. Emigration then should be clear, I think, how the totalitarian states close their borders. They close their borders to emigration. You can't leave. And that was like that under the communists in Bulgaria, for example, or in any communist country. So on the principle of, because the communist principle, just like for the Nazis or the National Socialists, is your life does not belong to you, your life belongs to the state. And the state deems how your life will be disposed of. So open borders, that honest people have the right to leave the country. Now today there's very few places you could go, right? I mean the countries that you'd want to go to, make it very difficult to get into. Very difficult to get into the United States. You can visit, but it's hard to get to go there to live and become a citizen. One of the places that I love, that if I chose not to live in the United States, that I'd love to live in, would be Switzerland. That's a brutally difficult place, to get into. But the right to emigrate, to leave the country, and of course the right to, if you're going to emigrate, you need to have someplace to go. That's better. The right of immigration, because honest people have the right, as part of the principle of individual rights, they have the right to, if you're an honest person, a hardworking person, you have the right morally to choose your country of residence and to become citizens of a free country. Now we're going to talk about the practical benefits of this in just a few minutes, but it's important to understand the moral case here that just as an honest person has the right to move from one part of his or her country to another, so we should have the right to cross borders. We're not criminals. We're not initiating force or fraud against innocent victims. We're honest, hardworking people. We should have the right to cross borders. It's just like with goods. Adam Smith, a long time ago, in Wealth of Nations, published in 1776, which was a great year for human liberty around the globe. Adam Smith made the case how international free trade benefits everybody. And it's the same thing with the flow of goods across national borders benefits everybody, and so does the flow of honest persons or honest immigrants across national borders benefits everybody. What was Bastiat's line, the great French economic journalist? I forget the exact line, but if goods and persons don't cross borders, then soldiers will. Something to that effect. And I think Bastiat is exactly right. So I think the government of a free society, in order to be the government of a free society, for that society to be free, must recognize the right of honest immigrants to cross borders. But at the same time, part of the government's moral obligations is to protect the lives and the safety of the citizens of the persons in that country. And so I think it's part of the proper role of the government of a free society to keep violent people out of the country as best as it can, to keep out criminals, and of course today, jihadists, commonly referred to as terrorists. But criminals, jihadists, or terrorists of any kind. And consequently, there must be very stringent or severe background checks on people immigrating into a free country. Now, the critics of the open immigration, or generally open immigration, will point out that this is enormously expensive. It is. It is enormously expensive to do background checks on people coming into the country to try and keep criminals and jihadists out. So where and from whom will this money come? And that's a very good question. So let's turn to the practical side here, the practical case for immigration, and that is, if you look at the history of the United States, the enormous productivity of immigrants vastly offsets this. The immigrant productivity is vastly greater than any possible cost of background checks. Notice, I could just give you a few examples from American history. Andrew Carnegie, penniless Scottish immigrant, revolutionizes the steel industry. Carnegie was known He's a great rags to riches story. You know, somebody who went from deep poverty to become, when he sold Carnegie Steel to a conglomerate headed by J.P. Morgan, early 20th century, he was one of the richest men in the world. He was worth, I don't know, $300, $400 million. Which, at $300 to $400 million back then was a lot of money. I'd take it today, but AUBG is not going to pay me that much. But back then, the purchasing power of $300 or $400 million would probably rival the $50 billion that Bill Gates is worth today in Microsoft stock. But anyway, Carnegie, the point here is this. Carnegie was known, if you read the biographies of Carnegie, he was known as somebody who was almost omniscient. No human being could be omniscient, but almost omniscient, all-knowing in the field of steelmaking. I mean, Carnegie knew everything about making steel, marketing steel, hiring, firing, delegating responsibility. He was an absolute genius, a creative genius of the steel industry in the way Michelangelo was in sculpture and painting. I don't think he gets the credit he deserves for that. The key point being that Carnegie was so efficient at mass producing steel that he brought down the price of steel enormously. I don't remember the exact numbers, but the price per ton of steel came down dramatically because Carnegie was mass producing it so efficiently at such a low cost, and consequently was able to make a profit at a very low cost and beat out his competitors because they couldn't profit at the low price he could. What follows from that? Look at this, fascinating the way innovations build upon innovations in a free society. Henry Ford had inexpensive steel to manufacture automobiles. And Ford consequently could then manufacture automobiles at a price low enough that millions and millions and millions of customers could afford to buy it. Skyscrapers use a lot of steel. Prior to Carnegie, it would have been prohibitively expensive to build skyscrapers in Chicago, New York City, or anywhere else. Inexpensive steel made that possible. And one thing that often gets overlooked when we talk about Carnegie's productivity and more broadly immigrant productivity, says we're Americans, we're proudly the fattest people in history. The agricultural technology that rolls off the assembly line at the John Deere plant, the tractors, the combines, the harvesters. I mean, the American cars I don't think are that good anymore. But the food that's produced, the United States is an enormous food producer. And one reason for that is American farmers aren't out working the North 40 with a hand plow and a mule. They're using state-of-the-art agricultural technology. Well, inexpensive steel is necessary for that, for the harvesters, combines, and tractors to be priced low enough for farmers to afford them. So that's it. Talking about immigrant productivity, I mean, Carnegie himself is just a walking example of that. But in any field you want to mention, we're in the Balkans, we have to discuss Tesla, right? And Tesla was a genius, without a doubt, who his main advance was the AC induction motor. He went into production with George Westinghouse in the United States against Edison and Edison's great reputation as the inventor of the incandescent electric light. But Tesla was right, Tesla and Westinghouse were right, that the AC alternating current was much more efficient at transmitting electricity across the vast distances of the North American continent. And of course, Tesla and Westinghouse won the war of the currents against Edison, made a lot of money. But notice again the productivity, the ability to transmit electricity across vast distances, and all that makes possible in industry, just in having electric lights in your home, and the ability to work by night, which is by electric light, is vastly better than candlelight or even gas lamps. So Tesla, enormously productive. Any field you want to mention. So far we've been discussing material wealth created by immigrants. Steel in Carnegie's case, electricity, efficiently transmitted electricity in Tesla's case, but intellectual wealth as well. I mean, Albert Einstein, escaping the Nazis, of course, fled to America and worked for his last years at Princeton University. one of the great physicists of history, creating theories in physics, intellectual. My favorite writer and philosopher, Ayn Rand. My students from last year know we read The Fountainhead. She was born in Russia, grew up under the communists, escaped the communists, came to New York City, wrote great novels. She wrote Anthem, The Fountainhead, Atlas Shrugged, created a philosophic system based in Aristotle. He unfortunately was not an immigrant. Well, yeah, actually he was, not the United States, obviously, in the 4th century BC, but from Macedonia, to Greece. And based in the philosophic system of Aristotle, and her novels have inspired millions of people, I think, to live better lives, both in the United States and around the world. I could go on and on with the examples, but from history, but I also want to turn to current events. But already, just from the history, we could see the productivity of immigrants has created so much intellectual and material wealth. And that's just in the United States, never mind what immigrants to other countries have contributed. Which is one reason why, I didn't support Donald Trump for president. The country, long before Trump, was moving to make it, for decades before Trump, moving to make it more and more difficult to immigrate into the United States. Trump just wants to take it to the next level and build a wall across the Mexican border, which I think is an insane idea. And we'll discuss Mexican immigrants in a couple of minutes. But let's turn from the history of immigrant productivity to current events. Look at some of the areas where the United States is enormously productive. Food production is one, we've discussed that briefly. But high tech, Silicon Valley is this wondrous place of immense creativity in so many different fields. Steve Jobs, of course, legendary for this. Dropped out of Reed College after one semester with his buddy Stephen Wozniak in the Jobs family garage. Created the future, as Steve Jobs put it in his not so modest way. But created Apple, which of course is a great company. But Sergey Brin, Jobs was born in the United States, but his father was a Syrian immigrant, right? His biological father was a Syrian immigrant to the United States. Sergey Brin, one of the co-founders of Google, emigrated to the United States from the Soviet Union. Jerry Yang, one of the co-founders of Yahoo, emigrated to the United States from Taiwan. Vinod Khosla, one of the founders of Sun Microsystems, emigrated to the United States from India. Andreas Bechtolsheim, another one of the founders of Sun Microsystems, emigrated to the United States from Deutschland, in Germany. Silicon Valley is filled with a large number of foreign-born engineers who've done enormously creative work. And that continues to this day. I had a personal friend working in Silicon Valley from India who is a very, very honest, hard-working, efficient guy. Back in the 90s, long before Trump, they deported him, sent him back to India. I said, if I had any juice with the immigration boys, I said, what are you, crazy? This guy's not a criminal. He's not a terrorist. He's a software engineer. He's doing very creative work. You should put out the red carpet for guys like this. Get them in the country. Now, the low-skilled workers, we've been talking about very high-skilled, producers so far. In some cases, geniuses. But the low-skilled, Andrew Carnegie, going back to him, or Tesla, or people like that. John Roebling, the German immigrant who perfected the suspension bridge and built the Brooklyn Bridge across the East River between Brooklyn and Manhattan. People like that might have come into the United States poor, monetarily poor, but they have what economists call, what they bring with them, what economists call immense human capital. Human capital. That is intelligence, creative ability in one field or another, and always that drive, that work ethic, that drive to work hard. Well, the low-skilled workers that Trump wants to, the low-skilled, many, this is not fair to Mexicans to claim that Mexican workers are low-skilled. Many are, very high-skilled. And they would be very good doctors, lawyers, engineers who want to come across. But the stereotype is the low-skilled worker that Trump wants to build a wall to keep out of the country. Now, I can tell you a story, a true story. I won't mention his name. Call him Manuel. It's not his name. He's an immigrant into the United States. He lives in New York. He and his wife live in the New York area, and they have a cleaning service. They clean houses. So I'm something of a slob, I'm not married anymore, so my apartment is a little messy. I hired, what did I say his name was? Manuel? I hired Manuel to clean my apartment. Did not ask him whether he's in the country legally or not. Because even if he's illegal, he's not going to tell me that. But I didn't ask. I'm on a don't ask, don't tell basis. Pay him in cash, and he and his wife do an outstanding job. It would take me all day. I'm not very efficient. It would take me all day to clean the apartment in a way that they do in like an hour. I pay them, $80 in cash, and they're very efficient at what they do. Now, this is not the same thing as Tesla designing the AC induction motor. This is true, but there's all kinds of honest, productive work. There's all kinds of honest, productive work. And cleanliness is important. I don't want to live in a pigsty, and you probably don't either. Somebody's got to clean it. Since I'm not very good at doing it myself, I hire somebody to do it. It's also probably not the best use of my time. That I could write books. This is what they call the division of labor, right? I could write books, make money, not as much as I like, but I can make money, and then I could pay somebody to work on my car, or clean my apartment, or fix the air conditioner, when it breaks, or something like that, division of labor. Anyhow, there's the low-skilled workers, and cleaning is not considered high-skilled work. Although I remember that doesn't mean that you can't make good money at this. They get $80, from me, the two of them. So two of them, they do it in like an hour, so it's $40 a piece per hour. My ex-wife, I remember hiring a Ecuadorian immigrant to clean our house, and I remember her. I forget her name. That's like 15 years ago. She also was very efficient at what she did. She rolled up that first day in a brand new, shiny, white Jeep Cherokee, a much better car than Regina or I drove. She had cleaning service, she started her own business. She was an entrepreneur. And she hired, a bunch of people to work for her. Well, she was a slave driver too. She clamped the whip on those little bastards, make sure they were working, make sure they were clean. But yes, I could tell she did very well. She had her own business. But anyhow, the point is that whether somebody's going to be a software engineer in Silicon Valley, or somebody's going to be an entrepreneur, and start their own business, or somebody's going to, clean houses, or whatever it is, the labor force participation rates in the United States do not lie. They show that the immigrant workers at any level are the ones most likely to be working long hours, and working productively. To put it simply, if somewhat brutally, there's a lot of native-born Americans that are lazy. They've been born into middle-class comfort. Not that that's a bad thing. But they've been born into middle-class comfort. They're used to it. They grew up with it. And they just take it for granted. I see it in my students. They're not hungry. They're not driven to really, excel, to work hard. It's just to work hard. That's not true of all Americans, by the way. I know a lot of native-born Americans who are very hard workers, including some people who are born into, affluent families. But as a general rule, the immigrants have a stronger work ethic than the native-born. Who are born into middle-class comfort. The labor force participation rates don't lie. They show immigrant workers, both legal and illegal, have a higher labor force participation rate than native-born Americans. And the history, this is true of the Latino immigrants that Trump has a particular animosity towards. It's true of immigrants in general in our day, and it's been true historically. One of my favorite books, I don't know if you guys know who Thomas Sowell is. He's an American economist, black American economist, brilliant guy. He's written like dozens of books. I have about a dozen of Professor Sowell's books on in my personal library. My favorite Thomas Sowell, if you want to Google him, Sowell is spelled S-O-W-E-L-L. Thomas Sowell. My favorite Thomas Sowell book is Ethnic America, which was written in 1980 maybe. But it's about all the different immigrant groups, all the different ethnic groups, you know, in the United States, the history of them. It's just fascinating, whether it's the Mexicans or the Chinese or the Jews, or Professor Pantelides here, the Greeks, the Italians, the Irish. Too bad Professor Cleary's not here. But all these different immigrant groups, and the Sicilians are a really good example, because it was a strong, the U.S. had basically open borders late 19th, turn of the 20th century. Millions and millions and millions of immigrants from Europe, most of them very poor, flooded into the United States in the late 19th and turn of the 20th century. And the Sicilians were, a major component of that. And it's interesting because in Sicilian culture, Professor Sowell points out, it was very agricultural in Sicily. You worked the land. And so the parents wanted the children at home working the land. And they resisted government education. They resisted, the state wanted compulsory education, put those kids in school. And the families resisted that. They wanted, first of all, they had a very tight-knit family, and they wanted the kids with them, not with some government appointed teachers. And second of all, they needed them to work the land. So the point being that the Sicilian immigrants, as people do, brought that culture with them to the United States. There was a very, very weak emphasis on education amongst the Sicilians. There was like 3 generations before you started to see a lot of these Italian kids go to college. I was in high school in the 1960s. I remember, you look at my yearbook, so where are you going after high school? I grew up in Brooklyn, it was a heavily Italian Jewish neighborhood. You look at all the Jews, the Weinbergs, the Grossmans, the Bernsteins, where you go to college? All the Sicilian, all the Italian kids go and work. It was the late 1960s before you started to see a lot of Italian kids in the United States go to college. The culture gradually changed. In the United States, the emphasis is go to college. The Sicilian culture finally gave way to it. But Thomas Sowell points out, the Sicilians had already risen into middle-class comfort by that time. In their case, it wasn't a college education that drove affluence levels. It was affluence levels that drove their college education. The Sicilians rose, as Sowell points out, by sheer work ethic. And the willingness to take is they're very similar then to a lot of the Latino immigrants today. The willingness to do any kind of work. Clean the sewers, we'll do it. Sweep the streets, we'll do it. Pick rags and sell rags, we'll do it. The Sicilians simply had the willingness to, 1, do any kind of work, and 2, work longer hours at crummy jobs that native-born Americans didn't want. And their rise out of poverty into middle-class comfort was fueled by a simple willingness to work harder than anybody else. That's absolutely true. My experience with the children of or grandchildren of Sicilian immigrants and the facts and figures that Sowell provides in his book. What's interesting here is that the Jews were very similar, because today in the United States, the Jews tend to be very affluent, except for the philosophy professors. But as a general rule, the Jews tend to be affluent. But by the time I was a kid, say 1960, or actually a little before that, post-World War II, a little before my time, 1945, the cliche of the Jewish doctor, the Jewish MD, was already in currency. In fact, the joke when I was a kid was, what's the definition of a lawyer? a nice Jewish boy that can't stand the sight of blood. Right, right. You want to go to medical school, you went to law school instead. That was already a cliche. By the post-war period, called 1950, the Jews had already carved out a niche for themselves in America as educated professionals. But that's not how it started. And Thomas Sowell points that out. The Jewish immigrants from Russia, Poland, Ukraine, this surprised me. You know, Sowell claims were the poorest immigrant group in the history of the United States, which is saying something given the Irish, you know, and the Sicilians. But it makes sense. The Jews were so oppressed for so long, the pogroms and everything, you know, in Eastern Europe, that it makes sense. The Jews started their rise from rags to middle-class comfort as in the so-called sweatshops, in the garment industry on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. I forget the exact dates, as Sowell points out. By 1915, during World War I, there was already a large Jewish population in New York City. There was very few Jewish kids, but as late as 1915, who had graduated from high school in New York City. They all left. Families were poor. They all left to go to work. A lot of them in the garment industry. But like the Sicilians, the Jews rose into the middle class by the willingness to simply work hard. Jacob Riis, so-called muckraker in American history, wrote a book, how the other half lives. You know, about the poverty, terrible poverty of the lower classes. And he pointed out that you could tell from, if you read the chapter on, what was it, the Jews of Sweattown? Riis, I think, was Danish. You could read, he wasn't a big fan of Jews, and he certainly wasn't a big fan of capitalism, which he thought exploited the workers. And yet, in that chapter about a chapter about the Jews, he pointed out the silver lining here. All these hours these guys work at the sweatshops, you know, making clothes. The silver lining, he pointed out, was they all have money in the bank. They're saving money. And of course, after one generation, they tended to move out of the Lower East Side of New York City into Brooklyn, Queens, the Bronx. Another generation later into the suburbs on Long Island or in Westchester County. Their children, and certainly their grandchildren, went to college. So, you see this point about immigrant productivity. We've seen it all through the history of the United States, going back more than 100 years ago and continuing to this day with the Latino immigrants. The sheer willingness to work hard and to take low, crummy jobs that the native-born Americans are simply too good for, you know, is what fuels the rise. A lot of the immigrants, you know, work really hard, and they're poor, but in case after case after case after case, their children and their grandchildren do much better. They go to college, and it opens up many different kind of jobs for them. Now, I want to read a quote to you. So let me find it. This is from my book. Actually, no, I don't have to look for it, because it's right here. From my book, Capitalist Solutions. In that final chapter on individual rights applied to representative issues, the war on drugs being one, and the stuff on immigration. Now, there's a couple, here. Speaking of current low-skilled immigrant workers, Jason Riley, editor for the Wall Street Journal, Riley noted, quote, by heading north, a typical Mexican immigrant can nearly quadruple his hourly wage, and that's even adjusting for cost of living differences. The average American worker sends home 41% of his pay to support his poor family. Riley's conclusion supports that of Linda Chavez, who also studied labor force participation rates nearly 20 years ago. Quote, we know from labor force participation rates that low-skilled immigrants are society's hardest workers, unquote. That's interesting. Let me repeat that. We know from labor force participation rates that low-skilled immigrants are society's hardest workers, unquote. So I raised the question, Should America become a country denying a home to humanity's hardest workers? Or should it open its magnanimous arms and clasp such workers to its bosom? Which policy is in America's long-term self-interest? Such immigrant willingness, then and now, to work at jobs generally scorned by the native-born is a universal win. The immigrants get to live and work in America with greater freedom and higher living standards than in the nations they abandoned, and their children and grandchildren tend to exceed them both educationally and economically. American employers get a supply of cheap labor willing to perform any task, no matter how menial. American customers enjoy the lower prices that result from a cheap labor supply. Low-skilled native-born workers competing for jobs with immigrants who enjoy the immense advantage of speaking fluent English and of knowing the culture thoroughly should be incentivized to upgrade their skills. So in other words, it's a win-win to open the borders and let in society's hardest workers. If somebody spent their entire life in politics, they may be ignorant of this. But somebody like Donald Trump, who's a successful businessman, who's built all over the New York area, and who's run a successful business, Trump should know. He should know that immigrant workers, as a general rule, tend to be society's hardest workers. So let me wrap this up so we can leave some time for question and answer. Let's summarize what we see. First of all, the principle of individual rights, the moral case, the principle of individual rights. Honest people have the right morally and should be recognized legally to cross borders, choose the country of their residence. They do good, not evil. They're hard working, they're honest, and their right to cross national borders to choose the country of their residence should be upheld and recognized by the legal system. Practically, we've seen the enormous productivity of immigrants, whether it's software engineers in Silicon Valley, whether it's steel makers like Andrew Carnegie, whether it's low-skilled Latino workers who clean houses or whatever it is, or the Sicilians or the Jews historically. We've seen the enormous productivity, and consequently, the background checks that we have to go through to try and keep, we always had to do it with criminals, and now we have the added incentive to keep jihadists out of the country. I've been spending a good deal of time in Great Britain lately, and you see the number of terrorist attacks in Britain this year. And one of the fears that drove Brexit, one of the reasons that the British wanted to leave the European Union, is their fear that, let's say, if Germany, for example, lets in a number of Muslims, some subset of whom may support jihad, well, those people can then gain entry into the UK. You can see the Brits fear about this. Anyhow, we need to keep murderers of all kinds out, whether it's garden variety criminals or people who are ideologically driven by religion or whatever. We need to do background checks. They're expensive, that's absolutely true, but I think we can see immigrant productivity vastly exceeds. The wealth created vastly exceeds the amount of money it's going to cost to do those kinds of background checks. So I think, what I mentioned Ayn Rand before, Russian immigrant to the United States. One of the beautiful principles from her philosophy of objectivism that I love, the moral is the practical. What's morally right here is to protect individual rights, the rights of honest people to cross borders, choose the country of residence, and the practical benefits of that is the immense productivity that a free country gains from immigration. So on that, let me wrap it up and go to questions. So thank you. Thank you. So this one's for you. There's some Smirnoff in here, right? And there's some Rakia. Questions? Yes, that's this lady over here.
So can you elaborate on your thoughts about Trump's immigration policies?
On Trump? Oh yeah. And I may use some four-letter words, but, you know, no, I'm just joking. The lady asked me to elaborate on my thoughts on Trump's immigration policy. Well, let me put this in terms that are printable, because we're at a university. Let's say Trump's very mistaken. Look, the objections to immigration, there's two major ones. The conservative objection is the fear that the immigrants are going to go on welfare and, you know, and cost the U.S. taxpayers a lot of money. The leftist objections, they're in bed with the labor unions, and the labor unions don't want to compete with immigrant workers, because the immigrant workers are willing to work for salaries that are much lower than the labor unions get. So Trump, who was a Democrat most of his life, you know, a friend of Bill and Hillary Clinton, a fundraiser for the Clintons, Trump, among other things, is an unprincipled opportunist. There was no hope of getting the Democratic nomination for the presidency. Obama was president, and, you know, his vice president, or in this case Secretary of State, was going to be the Democratic candidate. So he switched parties. You know, and it helped him gain the presidency. But anyway, he's a Republican now, and so he's not indebted to the labor unions. The labor unions aren't going to vote for him. They're not labor unions typically. Actually, I take that back. Since the Reagan era, a lot of the rank and file labor guys vote for Trump, even though both Republican, even though the labor leaders are all Democrat. The welfare state fear is that, and then there's the xenophobia. You guys know what xenophobia is? Fear of foreigners, fear of outsiders, fear of different tribes. It's a form of racism. Everybody's got to be like us. Maybe the classic case of that in the world today is Japan. Japan's a very homogeneous. Professor Pantelias lived and worked in Japan. I have not, but he does. You were an outsider, I suppose, when you were in Japan.
I was an outsider. They could see me from a mile away.
There comes that Greek-American guy, who's built like a linebacker anyway. You know, better avoid him. But the xenophobia, you see it in the United States. You know, there's still people, you know, if they're open to immigration at all, it would have to be white Europeans. You certainly don't want these dark, you know, Latinos, you know, coming in the country. So there's the xenophobic element too. But the welfare. What I hear from conservatives over and over again is the welfare state objection. So let me address that. And certainly Trump he said things about Mexican workers worse than that they're going to go on welfare. He just said Mexican immigrants were illegal Mexican immigrants were rapists, didn't he say something like that? Anyhow, the welfare state objection is a major one. So let me address that. The major one amongst the Republicans. And that is, you know, the idea that the immigrants are going to come into the country, go on welfare, they're going to cost American taxpayers an enormous amount of money. Well, there's two responses to that. I've already given one. As a matter of empirical fact, immigrants tend to be society's hardest workers. That includes Latinos. The labor force participation rates do not lie. So that's just ridiculous. Let me not be insulted. It's false. The idea is false. But worse than that, it's irrelevant. What we do about the welfare state should be a whole separate issue from immigration. They're not the same thing, and they shouldn't be conflated. Now, personally, I think the welfare state is a lose-lose situation in the long run for everybody, and I think it should be gradually phased out. But the point is they're two separate issues, and the overwhelming number of people on welfare in the United States are native-born U.S. citizens, not immigrants who have, you know, the strongest work ethic imaginable, and in most cases, and always did. So I think it's a very, very mistaken argument. As far as the labor unions go, the unions have, with the help of the U.S. government, they've lobbied for and they've gained labor legislation that in many cases force literally force employers to negotiate only with the unions. You see this in the auto industry is a good example. You can't hire non-union workers, scabs, or strike breakers in the union's non-objective terminology. Non-union workers are out. They can't get jobs in the auto industry and certain others, and the employers can't hire them. The unions have sought, and with the help of government legislation, have obtained a monopoly on the labor market. And since they have a legal monopoly on the labor market, they've been able to jack wage rates up much higher than they would be on a free labor market. Well, my message to the unions is one verb: compete. It's the essence of a free society. It's among the essence of a free society. It's among the essence of a free market. It's what enabled the United States to become the wealthy, powerful nation it has. Compete. I have to compete. It's very possible that, let's say, the Marist College, where I teach philosophy, let's say they can find an Indian in India who could do this by telecommunication, or just immigrate to the United States, who could teach my philosophy classes as well as I can, or better, and do it at willing to do it at a lower salary. I have to compete. And if Marist hires him or her instead of me, that's their right. That if the guy is good and he can teach the students, the person is good, they can teach the students effectively, then then I have no complaint. What I have to do is either be willing to work at that wage or go into another field. Today I'd probably just go drive for Uber, make more money that way. But I remember, I'm old enough to remember in the 1980s, as the computer revolution was beginning. 1980, nobody had a computer in their home. But in the 1980s, the computer revolution is beginning in business and in home. And I remember a number of people that I went to graduate school with in philosophy, thinking and doing, I'm not gonna be able to make a living here. But in the computer field, I can. And start taking night classes to study computer science and get jobs as programmers. Now hopefully, I saw a number of people do that. Hopefully, they're happy in their profession. Certainly that can be a very challenging profession. I know for sure they're making more money, which is a good thing. So sometimes you simply need to upgrade your skills or change professions. But the willingness to compete is part of a free society and a free economy. And if I lose my job to the Indian immigrant who could teach philosophy classes as well as I can, or better, at a lower salary, that doesn't mean I'm going to starve. I mean, the blacksmiths who were put out of business by the automobile revolution, brought about by Henry Ford, didn't starve. Some of them might have upgraded their skills and gone to work for the Ford Motor Company as assembly line workers. Similarly, for the people who made a living, have you guys ever seen a typewriter? Anybody seen a typewriter? In the United States, if I ask 20-year-old kids, a lot of them never even seen a typewriter. But when I was a kid, what were the big typewriter companies? Smith's.
Olivetti.
Who?
Olivetti.
Olivetti? I don't even know. Remington Rand, right? Smith, what was this? Smith Corona, right? Yeah. A lot of people worked not only with typewriters, but a lot of people obviously were working for the typewriter manufacturing, manufacturing typewriters. Well, when, computers replaced typewriters, which made white-collar office workers enormously more productive, and consequently could command higher salaries. The people who worked for the typewriter companies, which went out of business, they didn't starve. A lot of them probably upgraded their skills to be able to work with computers. My oldest sister, was a long-time secretary. She didn't work for a typewriter company, but she was a long-time secretary, who was a very skilled typist. Well, no more typewriters, but she took, she got on-the-job training from her employers to upgrade her skills, so she could work with the computers. But the people who worked for the typewriter companies needed to upgrade their skills, and get different jobs. We need to be willing to compete in the marketplace, and that's my point to native-born American workers and to labor unions in particular. They don't want to compete even with non-union workers, never mind with immigrants. You know, so compete, upgrade your skills. Speaking of immigrants, the Austrian economist Joseph Schumpeter, some of you, if you study business or economics, you might know Schumpeter, was an immigrant, a professor from Austria, a professor at Harvard for a number of years. Schumpeter called capitalism a process of creative destruction. I don't know if that's the best name, but you see the point. You know, you have a free market, you've unleashed the thinking of all these entrepreneurs. So Henry Ford, you know, mass produces automobiles, and you put out of business the buggy makers and the blacksmiths and the buggy whip manufacturers. Great movie, and that was Danny DeVito. What was Other People's Money? If you want to see, but people like Steve Jobs and Stephen Wozniak, and at Apple, Bill Gates at Microsoft, they fuel the computer revolution, which puts out of business typewriter manufacturers. Creative destruction. It's called progress is a better name for it, and we need to be willing to upgrade our skills. Immigrants are willing to uproot themselves from the only country and culture they've ever known, travel thousands of miles away from family and friends to a different culture, learn a new language. They're willing to, that is part of what makes immigrants such hard workers. They have this initiative, this drive to make their lives better. Well, we native-born Americans should at least have the willingness to upgrade our skills, you know, and compete in the marketplace. So I think Trump's main objection here, like so many Republicans, is the fear that immigrants are going to go on welfare, you know, and that's just false. And more than false, it's irrelevant. Even if it were true, they're not the same issue. They're two different issues. What we do with the welfare state is unrelated to what we do with immigration. Here's a nice quote, by the way, coming back here. I quote here from Nathan Glazer, an American sociologist. Let me find it here. But Glazer makes a really good. Nathan Glazer makes a really good point on this. And give me a minute. To. Here it is. Nathan Glazer made this exact point in the context of identifying the main difficulty of attempting to successfully restrict immigration. Quote, "Whatever our policies are, however, our biggest problem will be to carry them out in a world in which so many see entry into the United States as a way of improving themselves." Unquote. And that's absolutely true, even today. So many people see entry into the United States as a way of improving themselves. And I think they're right to see that. Notice, let me make one last point to this lady's question. Trump wants to build a wall. I mean, it's almost comical. A wall. One interesting difference with the communists is the communists built walls to keep people in. So Trump's saying the capitalists should build a wall to keep people out. Well, a wall, let me point out to President Trump, who's presumably a very intelligent guy, a wall is a very medieval technology, right? The Great Wall of China was largely successful in keeping out, not monsters, if you saw that ridiculous Matt Damon movie last year, but the Mongols, because in the Middle Ages, and the Mongols were warriors, man. They were some hard rocks, as they might say in Brooklyn. These were some tough guys. They were not very technologically advanced, and they had no means to get over the wall, or whatever. Today, you know how easy it would be to defeat the wall? I could see there's already these Mexican drug cartels that make a lot of money smuggling drugs into the United States. You put two and two together and get four. Guess what else these smugglers are now going to be able to make money smuggling in? Right, immigrants, workers. I can just see the Mexican drug cartels look at their shops You know, this is the Baptist, the bootlegger example, if you know that example. Get the boats ready, boys. Get the boats ready. Trump's going to build a wall across the border. Well, there's this big body of water. It's called the Gulf of Mexico. You know, we got boats. You know, and then there's this whole coastline here. It's called the Pacific Ocean. You know, we got boats to go up, you know, to San Diego or whatever. How are you going to keep people out? They'll helicopter over the wall, they'll dig under the wall, and above all, they will boat around the wall. The walls are medieval technology. There's no way. What it will do is it costs a lot of money. This is like the war on drugs. The war on immigrants will be like the war on drugs. It costs a ton of money. It'll be completely futile. It's going to be a major failure. And it is going to drive the homicide rate even higher. Because there's a lot of money to be made now in smuggling drugs. These thugs kill each other in competition. You know, gangsters don't look, they don't negotiate. You smuggle drugs in over here, and we'll do it over here, and we'll respect each other's. No, thugs don't work that way. They kill each other, so that they can get, you know, even a greater market share. Well, now they'll be killing each other for the lucrative profession of smuggling workers into the United States, not just smuggling drugs. Very predictably, the wall's going to be expensive, it's going to be a failure, and the homicide rate's going to go up. Those are the very predictable results of Trump's policy of building a wall. Thank God a lot of people in the United States realize this, and Trump hasn't gotten a lot of traction, you know, in his plan to build a wall. I haven't heard much about it lately either. I think maybe he realizes it's hopeless. I hope so. I'm sorry. I don't answer questions briefly. Other questions? I see a lady in the back.
I just wanted to ask, my question is connected again to Trump. I wanted to ask that the United States has a reputation of a free country, and
Yeah.
as you said, to be a free country, you should actually let the people who are willing to cross the border to cross the border. Moreover, like, immigrants have a big impact on the economy of the United States from the statistics we could see. And don't you think that actually if all the regulations that Trump is trying to pass, not only building the wall that is like something like unbelievable, but all other regulations that he's trying to pass for work and travel students and for like harder getting into the States, it would actually have a very negative impact for the country?
Yes, it's a good question. This lady's pointing out Trump's anti-immigrant policies are not restricted to building a wall. You know, he's making it more difficult for students to come into the country and go to school there, for students to come in. And where I know in the past, a lot of AUBG students worked in the United States in the summer, right? And I assume Trump's making that more difficult now. Oh, I know. Let me just give you a personal anecdote. And I'm not an immigrant. I got one of these, and the blue passport is my friend Arshak Benli, who's actually from Bulgaria, although he's Armenian. So I want to get one of those blue passports, which he now has. But he came to the country long before Trump. But I was in London, or in England a few weeks ago. I gave a lecture at Oxford. When I was at Heathrow to fly to New York, they grilled me. I mean, I felt like I was getting on an El Al flight to Tel Aviv. I mean, they spent 15 minutes grilling me like I was some kind of criminal or something. And this is part of Trump's policy, even to make it more difficult to gain entry into the United States. It's a big mistake for the reasons that I gave during the talk. The immigrant productivity has, I'll just repeat what I said, has been so immense, especially people, if you want to come to the United States and study. So, people go to some of the better colleges, or Stanford, or Princeton, or Harvard, or the University of Chicago, some of the top colleges in the country, some of the top colleges in the world. Where do a lot of those foreign-born students want to stay and work after they graduate? A lot of them want to stay in the United States. So if somebody comes from Bulgaria, let's say, or Moldova, which I didn't even know was a country until last year, but it is, I've been there. Wherever, from China, or who's that, I forget his name. Arthur, you might know, that guy from, that MD from Nigeria who was the one who figured out the concussion problem in the NFL. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Amamalu, was that his name?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, he was an MD from Nigeria. And, you know, he's the one who's made all these advances. The name of the disease is unpronounceable. But, you know, it's all about terrible brain injuries that you know, American football players suffer. He was the one who did the medical research. A lot of these guys a lot of these people wanna not just go to school in the United States, but they want to live and work in the United States. And for reasons that should be obvious, you want to keep out the MDs and the engineers, and you know, there's a name for this process of very highly skilled people with immense human capital coming into the free countries. It's called the brain drain. They call it the brain drain, and it immensely favors the free countries. It immensely favored the United States for a long time. This is why the Berlin Wall went up in 1961. It wasn't just that there was millions of people. I forget, I think like 3.5 million Germans escaped to the West, you know, because most of Germany the communists had sealed off. There was that little loophole in Berlin. It's like 3.5 million had fled to the West through Berlin. It wasn't a bunch of, you know, farmers that the communists were concerned with. It was what they called the brain drain. The Soviets didn't want to okay the wall because it allowed trade with the West and it allowed for consumer goods to come into the Eastern Bloc. The Soviets didn't want to build the wall. The East German communists lobbied with the Soviets for years to build the wall, and what finally convinced them was the brain drain, the engineers, the doctors, the teachers, the lawyers, the professors, the scientists, the writers. They were losing their most educated, intelligent people. Well, you want these people in your society. The communists built walls to keep them in. Now Trump's going to build walls to keep them out? Are you freaking kidding me? What are you, stupid? You want these people, the students that you're talking about, you want them. They're gaining skills. They're going to be enormously productive and very valuable. You know, you want them in the country. The brain drain favors you, President Trump. Let them in. Let them in. So you're absolutely right. It's absolutely, in any terms you want to mention, it's immoral. You're violating the rights of honest people to choose their country of residence. And it's impractical. You're keeping some of the most talented, hardworking, productive people out of the country. It's just wrong, and it's dumb. Can I make that any clearer? I'm not losing my passport. They'll never let me back in the country. Yes, this gentleman.
Do you think that what you mentioned, the opening of the borders, could eventually backfire, similar to the case of Britain?
What do you mean about Britain? You mean about jihadists coming into the country?
Well, the Brexit, it was a big factor there. Do you think that a negative outcome might occur?
What's the same? If I understand the question, you know, Trump's election and Brexit, to a large degree, are motivated by the same thing. There's a xenophobic, you know, fear of foreigners, which is, you know, a racist element. And then there's the economic element that we don't want to compete with the, you know, with the immigrant workers. So, so part of it, these issues are often complex. The part I empathize with is you want to keep criminals and jihadists out of the country. We've seen that in Britain in the last year. But that's why I advocate, you know, strong background checks. Again, I think the process of education here, we need to educate, you know, honest working people in Britain and the United States and other relatively free countries that they need to compete. They need to be willing to compete. That's what made the country wealthy in the first place. You know, the wealth that they enjoy is based on the freedom in the society and including in the marketplace. You compete, and even if you lose your job to an immigrant worker, it doesn't mean you have to suffer. If you have the willingness to upgrade your skills, as so many people have done historically, you could still do well in a free society, in a free economy. You could still do well. And I wasn't kidding before. I could probably make more money driving for Uber than I could teaching philosophy. It wouldn't be as much fun to me. I love dealing with the ideas. Driving around in a car all day is not my idea of excitement. But I have to make money to pay my daughter's tuition, so I'll do what it takes. So the willingness to make changes in your life. A lot of people don't want to make changes in their life. I know selling shoes. That's what I've done all my life. And if my parents had a shoe store, I have a shoe store. If Walmart puts me out of business because they sell shoes cheaper than I do, I'm lost, I'm sunk, I'm going to starve. And so I lobby the city council, pass laws, don't let Walmart build a store, and out with that. No, it's much better attitude is if Walmart sells shoes cheaper than we do and puts our store out of business, Walmart may build a store here next year. That gives me a year or two lead time to figure, what do I want to do? Do I want to study computer science? Computer science obviously anybody who's skilled, in computers has a real, which I'm not. I'm a very low-tech guy. But anybody who's skilled in that area has a real advantage in a competitive marketplace. And from what I understand, it's not even that difficult. What do I want to do? Do I want to drive for Uber? Do I want to, upgrade my skills, and study computers? Do I want to relocate? A lot of people feel like they're locked into one job, one profession, one town, one area. And it's the exact opposite of the immigrant mindset. We'll cross the ocean, we'll go around the world, we'll learn a new language, we'll leave our friends and family behind, we'll go to a different culture. The immigrants have this very expansive view of life's possibilities. A lot of native-born Americans feel like they're locked into this very narrow. You gotta educate them. It's a big world, bro. There's a lot of things you could do. You're not necessarily locked into selling shoes. There's other things you can do with your life. In other areas, if you want to sell shoes, there's other areas where Walmart doesn't have a store. Like go to New York City. New York City won't let Walmart build a store. I gotta leave in a few minutes. We got time for one more. Anybody who hasn't asked a question?
So you said that state should work for society, therefore society chooses its leaders through votes and elections. Presumably the voters for Trump has his thinking. What or who can change the thinking of society towards migration?
Oh, that's a good question. How do we change the thinking of society about immigration? Well, to answer that, I have to go much broader than that. Again, I agree with Ayn Rand, Russian immigrant, that philosophy ultimately is what drives an individual's, the philosophy held is what drives an individual's life or a society. For instance, notice the example I just used. Immigrants' philosophy tends to be very different than many of the native born. They have a view that the world is wide, it's broad, it's open. They're willing to change careers, countries, cultures, languages, learn new skills, new language, new culture. Whereas a lot of the native born will want to compete. They have a very narrow view of life's possibilities, very different philosophy. And here's where I think, first of all, I recommend everybody here to read Ayn Rand's books. I think the two in particular that I would read is The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged. But I certainly want to do everything I can to promote people, all over the world, in the United States, in Britain, Switzerland, let's say, or anywhere else, to read Ayn Rand and realize the virtues of freedom and reason, of the rational mind in human life, and of freedom to liberate the rational mind and create a lot of wealth. If we realize that, we'll realize then, once we realize the value of the mind, rational thinking, operating in a free society, then we'll be able to value this great immigrant productivity I've been talking about. Then we'll say, yeah, the brain drain, let them in, let them come. Let them come here. We want the doctors and the engineers and the software guys and the entrepreneurs. We want them here. They create wealth. And the low-skilled guys who clean houses or work as as the Sicilians did, cleaning the sewers or whatever. Those are jobs that have to be done. Maybe the robots will do that in the future. But you know who probably create the robots? Probably foreign-born engineers in Silicon Valley. You know, that some American-born engineers too. But anyhow, I think Ayn Rand's books, it's philosophy works slow, but this is a philosophic problem. It's a problem of people's philosophy. There's no other way to deal with a philosophical problem than with a better philosophy. And I think the good news is Ayn Rand, again, she was a Russian-born immigrant to the United States. I think Ayn Rand's books and philosophy of objectivism make that possible. So I strongly recommend everybody to read it and give copies of the Fountain and Atlas Shrugged to everybody you know, especially to Trump and his supporters, so that they can come to appreciate the vast amount of immigrant productivity. Speaking of which, I have to get to Sofia. You know, one thing I learned in Bulgaria, it's pronounced Sofia, right? Everybody in the United States pronounces it Sophia, but it's Sofia, right? My good buddy Colleen Manoloff, who you might know as a TV journalist, has me speaking on capitalism, the moral basis of capitalism, to a bunch of Bulgarian politicians at 4 o'clock, 1600 or so. Now, what my Bulgarian students taught me last year is that Bulgarian politics is corrupt as hell. And so I didn't know that, but I learned that from my students. So you can wish me good luck in speaking to the Bulgarian politicians. But I got to get a taxi, but thanks everybody. I'll put this